and thank Howard and Margaret for inviting me to do this. I came from, or I come from, I guess I came from and I come from a musical family. Not like the Jacksons or anything like that, but everybody in the family played music or sang. And so growing up, my father was in a glee club, my mother played piano, one sister played the saxophone and piano, one sister played the violin, and I played the trumpet. So it was kind of ever present in my childhood. And so I want to start with a older poem written in the last century. It's really cool when you get to a certain age and you can say, well, in the last century I was doing this. You know, I also realize that I've known people now who were born in 3 different centuries, you know, which is also kind of mind-blowing. Anyhow, this is called Sacred Music, and it's dedicated to my sisters. I never heard our father play. They say he swayed our mother with his sax as she waited tables in an upstate hotel, and he made music for her customers' dancing pleasure. Till one day, he wrapped her in raccoon and in a friend's borrowed ragtop. They motored off to New York. Big city boy, small town girl, their world swinging into war. At the end, I began wailing. Fat little baby plaints our mother soothed on the piano, as our father bruised the air with his earnest baritone voice. Pop tunes, show tunes, the great American songbook. The last time I heard our father, his voice had turned to a bluesman's rasp. I wet his lips, gave him sips of water. On the cassette by his bed played Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. Its streetwise eloquence smoothed his shadowed face. He was singing, standing at our mother's shoulder, as her fingers danced the keys, both so deep in to the music their song became a kiss, a touch, an act of making love. I came to Eugene in 1972, and about 1982 I got a phone call from a guy who I'd gone to high school with, and he was living in LeGrand, had been living in LeGrand about as long as I had been living in Eugene, and he was putting on a little blues festival at his house. He lived in the mountains up above LeGrand, and he invited me, and he invited a couple of other guys that we had gone to high school together in New York. And so the first night they had a blues concert and a lot of music, and the next morning, because everybody had overindulged, there were a few of us that kind of got up and were sitting around, and this conversation came up, and our friend Bugs, which is short for Bugsy, who was a guy we went to school with. I didn't know that his name was James until 10 years later. He was Bugs. But anyhow, he had a way of changing the direction of the discussion, and we were just kind of sitting there and talking about anything, and he could change things into a theological discussion, right? You know, just off the bat. So this is, it's called a blues for Bugs. Billy leans in the morning's rising heat. His voice fills with smoke and dried roses. Love, a song, all the blues from the sky, the sea. Love, he says, taught me to believe the joy flesh brings to flesh is a trick. Breath can't braid to breath, make a rope to hold me to this spinning planet. Joe says, but the Lord never gives us more than we can handle. And I think even Jesus begged his Father for a break. Love, maybe it teaches us to play the blues, bend an ear to the heart, hear God crying for one more day of heartache, one more night without sleep. About 3 years ago, there was a show at the Schnitzer Museum, and it was a large show, and the work of an artist who also happened to be a singer-songwriter, Rick Bartow, was exhibited. And I don't know if people are familiar with him, but Rick Bartow is a Native American artist, singer-songwriter, grew up in Newport. His father was from the Wiyot tribe from California. Bartow himself was a Vietnam vet. And he was an art teacher, and then he eventually had enough success that he became a full-time artist. And he was an amazing artist. If you saw his work, you know. And his art drew from not only his Native American background, but his experience traveling in Japan. He traveled and spent some time with the Maori. He spent some time in West Africa. So his art reflected all of those different cultural influences. And just before this show, he had I think maybe about a year before, I think he had suffered a stroke. And they didn't know whether he was going to be able to make art anymore. And he did. And he actually incorporated that whole experience into his art. So anyhow, this poem is just a poem sort of celebrating that day when his show opened. And it's called Out on a Limb. Out on a limb, lone crow chortles and caws as the crowd gathers below. There are speeches, a proclamation from his hometown mayor. His Wiyot people sing and drum a song of praise. Bartow says a few words, then walks into the crowd chanting, shaking hands gently, inviting them to join his song of gratitude to Creator. The museum doors open. The crowd ascends into a gallery of teeth, feathers, bones, eyes. Bears fashioned from wooden blocks, sticks, and pegs. Heads carved just enough to reveal the spirits within. One bear's shoulders bristle with iron nails, each driven in called out the spirit when it was needed. At one end of the room, a long, curved driftwood arm extends a carved hand the size of a grizzly's paw. Where the shoulder should be, Coyote's head leaned back, eyes fixed on an invisible point above. From nothing, Coyote creates himself, and I turn. Bear coming! From behind. Eyes narrowed, teeth bared. Bear's face splatters through a man's face. The man's eyes wide as eyes of a Santeria woman I once saw, dancing, smoking a cigar, her voice roaring with Chango's thunder. At the other end, Frog in orange breeches looks over to Crow's side of the tail. Crow standing tells this side, that side, inside, outside, right side, wrong side, upside, downside, as many sides as there are stories telling this world into being. And as I descend, Bartow and the backseat drivers fill a room below with songs. The words once eased from his tongue before a vein collapsed and they lapsed from memory. Now he reads the marks he'd made in a book to hold those words and turns them to sounds as his fingers pick and strum. The crowd whoops and hollers, and he sings, I was out on a limb again. I became interested in my early 20s in photography, and I decided I was going to be the next great French photographer from New York. And so I bought myself a camera. I couldn't afford a Leica, so I got a Miranda, which was sort of the Japanese version of the Leica. Good camera. And started taking pictures of everything, And a few years after I moved to Eugene and got a lucrative job in a government program teaching, and couldn't afford to keep up my photography for a while. And I managed to take it up again when I was about 40, and spent some time in dark rooms, and then gradually the last 10 years or so gone over to the evil side and do digital. And one of the things I did, I found myself going to a lot of museums to look at photography and also other visual arts. And I began to take pictures of people, of the art, but also people looking at the art. And there is a tradition of that in photography. You'll see a lot of great photographers. I'm not including myself in that, but a lot of photographers do that, have done that. And it's very interesting. And so in the process, I started looking at portraits, and eventually I started doing some portraits myself, and looking in museums at different self-portraits. And so these are 3 poems, and they're sort of related to one another. They take place in 3 different museums, and they all deal one way or another with the idea of self-portraits. The first one is the Louvre, and it's 3 self-portraits. The tall boy in flip-flops, shorts, and an I Love New York t-shirt muscles his way to the end of the gallery, turns, raises his left hand, extends his arm fully, pumps his chest, flexes his right bicep, glances over his shoulder, smirks, and shoots his self. The divine half-naked Miss Venus de Milo, beautifully composed beside him. The young woman in the gleefully red flowered dress gracefully slips through the narrow spaces between drowsy lovers, between tired mothers and hungry children, until she reaches the velvet rope that holds the pressing crowd. She turns her back, raises her right hand high, tries a few different smiles, then shoots herself. La Gioconda, posing patiently behind her. The wan teenage girl in the gauzy gossamer dress drifts through the museum's lazy late afternoon light to the far gallery wall, turns, tilts her head way back, extends her left arm slowly, inches her hand up, down, side to side, closes her eyes and shoots, her face floating beside the blanched, haloed visage of La Jeune Martyre, the young martyr. On that same trip, we went to the Musée du Quai Branly, which is a anthropology museum, and is another sort of way of looking at portraits and self-portraits. So the Musée du Quai Branly, transubstantiation. Grade school children dance through flowing word streams, projected on the dark floor of a winding entry. Ahead, directional signs, Afrique, Asia, Les Amériques. They turn at Oceanie. There are horns, drums, chants, the music of transubstantiation. One being becomes an other, wears an other's robes, an other's bones, feathers, teeth, skin. One's eyes look out through an other's. The teacher points to a feathered mask. Asks if the person who wears that mask really becomes a bird. A dark-eyed girl raises her hand, enthusiastically nods her head, yes. The teacher slowly shakes hers, no, not really. And the last one was in the Musée d'Orsay. There was a Van Gogh show, and it was actually Van Gogh and Artaud. And so the gallery had a lot of paintings by Van Gogh, and then on the walls were printed things that Artaud had written about art, some of it about Van Gogh as well. And so this is Musée d'Orsay, Van Gogh's self-portrait. From the gallery wall, Artaud scolds the experts. Van Gogh is nothing else. He is a painter, not a savior, not a social critic. He paints with quick, tight strokes, a black background illumined with steel flashes of blue. His head and shoulders turn slightly to the right. His jacket a weave of muted autumn colors. His red hair and flecked beard bristle and spark. Green horizontal slashes, verdant tribal markings tattoo the skin above and below. His eyes look left into dusk, blind blaze as it ignites his face. In a year, he'll fade into a liminal wash of twilight and vanish in the dark. I'm going to keep going here a little bit on this photography subject. I was in another museum, San Francisco MoMA, and before that had been closed for, I think, for 5 years, just was reopened. They did just a lot of huge building projects there. And there was a show there, it was called Photography in Mexico. And I went into the show, and it was a really beautiful show, really interesting. And as I was there, I was taking notes on different photographs that, for some reason, they sort of caught my eye or interested me in one way or another. And I thought, well, how can I take this and sort of turn it into this experience into a poem? And so I sort of structured it as a gallery, moving from one photo to another photo, and then writing generally short poem for each one of those photos. And just the fact, I always like putting black ink on white paper. It's very photographic for me. And so if as I'm reading this, you can kind of think we're going to be moving kind of from one photo to another. And it also happened to be that it was arranged chronologically. And I was reading these and getting ready to read them, and I thought, wow, these still speak very loudly today, very loudly. So the titles are in Spanish. So what I'll do is I'll give you the artist's name, give you the English translation, the Spanish title, and then I'll read the poem. So the first one, Tina Modotti, Workers' Demonstration. Manifestación de Trabajadores. Shot from above and behind, with shallow depth of field. 77 straw sombreros, brim to brim. Crowned sunlit, fill a tight 8 by 7 centimeter frame. 77 workers in the shade beneath their shadow hats, pressed shoulder to shoulder down a worn narrow street, curving in to blind flashes of light. I'll move over here. Manuel Alvarez Bravo, worker on strike assassinated. Obrero en huelga asesinado. Striking worker assassinated, lies in the street. Hair blood drenched, one eye open, his young body beautiful. A sculpture old as the history of sacrifice. His face a sacred mask cast in ensanguined shadow and astounded light. Victorious Sabunaris, no title. sin título. 1,000 years of journeys through the Sonoran desert bearing gifts, macaw feathers, copper bells, seashells, to Chaco's kivas in the north. Now this land is crucified beneath barbed fences of wire and steel, lit by searchlights, watched by drones, guarded by vigilante posse with their blackened eyes, blatant camouflage, automatic weapons and night goggles. Late arriving pilgrims invoking their inalienable rights. Graciela Itabide, angel woman, Sonoran desert. Mujer Ángel, desierto de Sonora, Mexico. And there are 3 Spanish words in the poem: cabra, which is goat, vaca, cow, and perro, dog. Black hair falling to back of knees, black skirt, white blouse billowing, bare feet gliding over stones as she descends from the high place to the desert's arid floor. In her right hand, a large radio filled with thunder and flutes of dark rain. In her left, one end of a rope. At the other end, unseen, maybe una cabra, una vaca, or un perro del infierno, a hellhound, stolen from the mute banks of death's shallowing river. And the last, Enrique Metanides, recovery of a drowned body in Xochimilco, onlookers reflected in the water. Rescate de un ahogado in Xochimilco con público reflejado en el agua. Along the upper edge, from the far bank, a line of mourners cast their bodies across a gray reflected sky. From the lower left corner, a hand plays out a taut rope to the waist of a man creating ripples as he opens the water with his hands to reach another man floating face down, legs folded straight beneath, as if he's standing on the lake bed looking for his breath. And I'm going to skip, probably about 5 minutes, is that?
Yeah, you got a lot more time, 5 minutes, easy.
Okay. Okay, I would just read 2 more. Now we're going to go back to music again, and I'll end up with two poems dealing with music. This one sort of deals with something that it's always good to have sisters, because they always wanted to use you as a dance partner. And I had 3 sisters, so I got a lot of work on this. And so this is called Learning to Dance. So going back to our music here. Learning to dance. My older sister taught me how to dance in the basement. Stack of 45s by the record player. At first, no music. My right hand in her left hand on her shoulder, her right on my waist. She counted the steps, slowly, then faster, faster, till she dropped the needle on tequila. By week's end, I took the lead, unwound her from my left hand, passed her behind my back, caught her with my right, twirled her twice and dipped her, then began again. At the hop, rockin' robin, goodness gracious, great balls of fire. No one taught me how to slow dance. I spied on my sister and her girlfriends, dancing with one another, making fun of how the boys moved clumsily as they tried to get close. I would be cool. I'd use my spins, my turns, and if the lights were low enough and I had just a little luck, in the still of the night, I might dip into a kiss. And this last poem came about, we had a friend over who was also a poet, and I was telling him about a book by Federico Lorca that he wrote about what's called duende. And I was sort of explaining what was in this book, and he stopped me and he said, duende? I know duende. I grew up in the Philippines. And my mother always told me when I went into the jungle, I needed to watch out because the duende would get me. And I thought, oh. And then we got talking about something else. And so after I thought, okay, how did duende get to the Philippines? And then I said, well, of course, the Spanish occupied the Philippines in the beginning of the 20th century. And so then I looked a little farther and I said, well, let me look back into Spanish culture. And I found that the duende, I mean, Lorca used this as kind of the creative force that comes from the earth, kind of thing. But in Andalusia, the duende are small people, little people in the forest and in the mountains that you had to watch out for, because you might go up that trail and you may never come back because the little people would get you. And then I was thinking about, yeah, and where else do we find this? These little people?
Mount Shasta.
In Ireland, right? But in Ireland, okay, the unhurtful form is, are the leprechauns. But the little people in Ireland, they tell you, watch out. You might not come back. You mess with them, you're better off. There's a lot of stuff going on here. And so this is a long introduction to. I was watching a video on my computer. It was a music video, and it was a group, a Cuban pianist named Alfredo Rodriguez and his band, which was called the Invasion Parade. And they were in a concert at Montreux. And I remember thinking, just came to my mind, I thought, wow, I mean, these folks are playing with duende. I mean, they were just, it was really, coming out of the earth, what they were doing. And I thought, well, let me see if I can write a poem that maybe communicates what was going on or what I was feeling, and kind of gives you that sense of duende. So this is called Alfredo Rodriguez and the Invasion Parade at Montreux, a video for Sam. So we still have a little photography thing here, but now it's video. Alfredo Rodriguez is shattering the keys on his piano. Left hand rumbling Chongo's thunder, right hand chanting a litany of saints. As the drummer ticks time on his iron bell, the saxman builds a house of breath. The trumpet player cries through his horn's blind eye. The bassman leans his ear to hear his voice of wood. Alfredo Rodriguez is chattering the teeth on his piano. As the drummer's limbs play in 4 different time zones, the saxman climbs in and out his windows. The trumpet player unwinds long blue vines of notes, and the bassman sprouts an enormous green ear. Alfredo Rodriguez is dancing the sacred steps on his keyboard. The drummer snatches thunder from Alfredo's fingers, tattoos it on his skins as the trumpet player puckers his lips to kiss the blood moon. The bassman's long dreads blossom and bear sweet, sweet fruit. Alfredo Rodriguez rises and leaves an offering, a rosary of holy water on his keyboard. The drummer wipes the rhythmic rain drops from his eyes. The saxman locks his door and lays his breath to rest. The trumpet player's right hand tenderly raises Alfredo's left as the bassman plucks the last ripe note from its still vibrating string. Thank you.